omnipotence, have mercy!
After you've scrubbed all the floors in Hyrule, then we can talk about mercy. Take him away.
Yes, my liege.
Alright, my cat's been pawing at this thing for like 45 minutes. These lights are hot as shit. I usually have a fan blowing on me at all times. We gotta get this over with, alright? So, if you will, please join me as I take you on a journey through time, and we look at a strange little console and its even stranger games. Cheers, everyone. In 1982, a joint venture took place between Sony and Philips, which resulted in the creation of the compact disc. This digital storage medium represented seemingly limitless potential, especially in the world of video games. Together, Philips and Sony would iterate on the technology, developing the Compact Disc Interactive, or CD-i. The CD-i wouldn't be limited by any one format. It would be a multimedia experience with graphics, full-motion video, and high-quality music. So it was that Philips and Sony began developing the CD-i player as their foothold into the home console market. The system would stand in stark contrast to the strictly game-focused experience of most home consoles. However, Sony would part ways with Philips, instead courting Nintendo and promising to deliver a powerful CD-based add-on for the SNES. This could have been a beautiful friendship, but it was really a power play on Sony's part. They planned to use this leverage to enter the console market for themselves. Nintendo, recognizing this treachery,
I know it was you.
Sony PlayStation.
You broke my heart.
Publicly broke up with Sony at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, choosing instead to partner with Sony's other scorned ex, Philips. As we now know, Nintendo created a monster that day, a dark reflection that would haunt them even to this very day. A reflection known as the PlayStation. This is not really a PlayStation, it's very small. Do we have a real... It's the PlayStation. This one's big, normal size. Ultimately, they would jam on Philips' proposed CD add-on as well. However, in order to maintain their legally binding contract, they had to supply Philips with the rights to several of their beloved characters. Among these chosen were Link, Zelda, and Ganon. And there was others too.
Yay, Luigi?
Wow, what a tragic and Machiavellian story of broken promises, love, betrayal. In a perfect world, Philips may have cut their losses and promptly returned to the electronics manufacturing market, seeing the CD-i as a failed venture, maybe a lesson learned. This is not a perfect world. It's a fucking thing. Philips would contract several different studios to develop games based on these Nintendo properties, one of which was Animation Magic. They were responsible for the development of two Zelda games, Zelda the Wand of Gamelon and Link the Faces of Evil, both of which use the same engine, play almost identically, and were released on the same day. A third game titled Zelda's Adventure was released a few years later, having been developed by a different studio called Viridis. It's no secret that these games haven't been received particularly well. In fact, they've passed into dubious legend. And I plan on taking a close look at them all, how they play, and the context surrounding them. Now, while I'm healthy and wealthy in spirit, I'm broke. Hey, real ass king, you know? I'm a man of the people. Unfortunately, I was unable to acquire an actual Philips CD-i with the original game discs. That stuff is ridiculously expensive.
Come back when you're a little... richer.
CD-i emulation has been in a very dicey place for years, and it is still a gigantic pain in the ass, but thankfully, after much blood, sweat, and tears, I was able to get same CD-i up and running. I decided to go with the Wand of Gamelon first, the game in which you play as Zelda. I'm gonna let the intro cutscene play uninterrupted here, but I challenge those of you who are familiar with Zelda CD-i. Try to go into this with a fresh mind. Pretend that you've never heard of these games before. This is your first time being exposed to this, okay? Alright, roll the tapes.
Zelda, Duke Onkled is under attack by the evil forces of Ganon. I'm going to Gamelon to aid him.
But Father, what if something happens to you?
I'll take the Triforce of Courage to protect me. If you don't hear from me in a month, send Link.
Stop the tapes. Okay, I know, I'm sorry. I said I was gonna let them play uninterrupted, but there's too much. We gotta pick some things apart here. Rewind a bit. Okay, stop. So, first of all, the animation itself. It has a distinctive animation magic quality to it. Somewhat analogous to the Microsoft Paint scribbles I used to do instead of paying attention in typing class. There's no shading or lighting, really, and there's an unsettling quality to all their movement.
You don't hear from me in a month, send Link.
Characters just can't stay still. If they're not gesticulating to the extreme, they're being zoomed into the camera. They're all amorphous. I don't really know how to explain it, but it's like they're being over-animated and under-animated at the same time. I also love how they just drop you into the central conflict literally within 4 seconds of starting a new game.
Zelda, Duke Onkled is under attack by the evil forces of Ganon.
Now, this might be controversial, but I actually kind of like CD-i Link.
Oh boy, I'm so hungry, I could eat an Octorok.
There's sort of a dopey, innocent dork quality to him that it kind of makes him endearing.
When I'm crouching, you can make me do the duck walk. Cool, huh?
I don't know, this could just be Stockholm Syndrome after playing all of these games for so long, but I don't know, he's a likable wiener.
A whole month gone, and still no word.
I'm certain he's all right.
Yeah, that old Ganon's no match for the king.
Link, go to Gamelon and find my father.
Great, I can't wait to bomb some Dodongos.
Okay, just to reiterate, the king goes to Gamelon to help Duke Onkled, OC, Donut Steel, fight the evil forces of Ganon. Just the king, with the Triforce of Courage, of course, which I guess provides protection now.
I'll take the Triforce of Courage to protect me.
Maybe that's what this thing is. So he gets himself into some hot trouble there, goes missing or whatever, and everybody decides the best course of action is to send Link. This 280-pound linebacker with a magical protection triangle couldn't hack it, but the Royal Make-A-Wish kid will surely do the trick. Something happens to Link, so then Zelda just goes herself. Well, I mean, with Impa.
Wake up, Impa. We're going to Gamelon.
All right, dear. I'll get the Triforce of Wisdom.
I gotta say, they really did the king dirty in this game. What kind of a king has to go himself to deal with problems? I mean, it's one thing if you bring, like, an envoy or something, but, like, by yourself?
Anyway, the game now begins with an overworld map. You only have access to a few areas off the hop, but as you complete levels, you'll unlock further stages and alternative routes in existing ones. Note that when Animation Magic began developing these games, there'd only been 2 Zelda titles, The Legend of Zelda and The Adventure of Link. When you think of classic Zelda, you probably think of the top-down style, but as Zelda 2 was primarily a side-scroller, that tradition hadn't really been established yet. This fact helps contextualize 2 things. The first of these is the perspective. Gamelon and Faces of Evil are both side-scrolling platformers flavored with Zelda elements. The second of these is the complete and total lack of quality control on Nintendo's part. Nowadays, it's hard to imagine Nintendo letting some nobodies work on their most precious IPs. They jealously guard their franchises, going so far as to send mail bombs to anyone who draws Zelda fan art. But back in the 90s, they took a more laissez-faire attitude towards their characters. Nintendo's involvement started and stopped with the approval of character designs. Even then, it's hard to say how much they really cared. When you start the game, you might be a bit confused or overwhelmed, so thankfully there's a handy help option in the main menu. Let's check it out.
Come on, let's go fight Ganon's evil legions. I'll show you how. I crouch when you move the controller down. When I'm crouching, I can walk like this. It's easy.
I don't own a legitimate CD-i controller, but I'll bet you pretty much anything that moving the controller down doesn't actually make Zelda crouch. This is the world of Gamelon, and I couldn't really tell you much about it because it's conspicuously absent from the Hyrule Historia. But let's just say that it's Hyrule adjacent. It's an island that's host to some pretty standard fantasy environments. Castles, magical forests, that kind of thing. The first thing you've got to come to terms with is that these games are doing something very different than pretty much any other Zelda game. There are no puzzles and really not much by way of exploration either. The levels themselves are essentially linear gauntlets through enemies and platforming challenges. They're also quite small, limited to about 2.5 or 3 screen sizes per area, thanks to technical limitations. So levels themselves are actually comprised of 2 to 5 sub-areas, often giving you entirely different challenges within the same level. All Zelda games have had combat in some form, be it the straightforward connecting of a sword to an enemy's face, to the calculated abuse of an in-game physics system to deliver bizarre results. Whatever the case, I don't think simple is a bad word here. Like, nobody looks at A Link to the Past and thinks, oh man, the combat in that game feels bad. However, swinging a sword in Wand of Gamelon feels bad. For the most part, this is because of the total lack of animation on the swing itself. A Link to the Past, for instance, gives Link's sword 9 full frames of animation for a swing. In addition, the player is given instant visual and often audible feedback that they're successfully delivering damage to an enemy. If the enemy isn't killed, they're usually knocked back, which earns you a brief moment of safety before you gotta time another swing. It's satisfying in its simplicity. The original Zelda gets away with a 1-frame animation because, well, A, the feedback is prevalent here as well, and B, the level of control you have over Link is sublime. There's not a frame of delay between you pressing the button and the sword doing the thing that it's supposed to do. Wand of Gamelon uses a 1-frame animation as well and drops the ball in some key areas. First of all, Zelda's sprite kind of lurches forward when you hit the attack button. You have to take that into account and compensate for this bit of distance, making things feel unwieldy already. But that's only a small part of the problem. The bigger issue here is the total lack of feedback. Enemies aren't knocked back, there's little indication that they're taking damage, and their animations are totally unbroken. This means your competence doesn't earn you safety, and you often just have to cross your fingers and hope that they'll die before they hit you. When you get hit in most 2D action games, you'll briefly blink with invincibility. Under normal circumstances, making contact with an enemy sprite causes damage. The game is actually running a bunch of calculations per second, so even one brief second of contact could actually result in the game assuming that you've been hit many different times. In order to prevent this, one hit will initiate a short invulnerability state. This gives you a chance to move away, collect yourself, and then try again. Sometimes the game will knock you back just to separate you from the enemy, like a referee in a boxing match. This is not how Wand of Gamelon works. When you get hit by an enemy, there's no invulnerability, there's no knockback. Zelda is just cruelly shredded to pieces before your very eyes, and you can do naught but watch. This makes the guesswork of the combat so much more painful. I swear, and I'm not just being salty, well, I am, but that's not just it, like 60% of the time you die in this game, it's from bullshit. For instance, most of the enemies are either too short to reliably hit even when crouching, or fly at this perfect altitude that you kinda have to jump slash. Now that'd be fine, but the controls are so gummy and unresponsive that it's not easy to pull off. To explain what I mean by that, I'll try to be as precise as possible, but you really need to play this game to know what I mean. Don't do that, but you would have to know what I mean. Let's start with the basic gestalt here. Up is jump. Okay, problematic. I'm angry already. Not a good jump button, especially for a platformer. Your left thumb has very limited real estate that shouldn't be occupied by more than one movement input at a time. Button 1 uses your sword, button 2 uses whatever item you currently have equipped. Button 2 also opens doors, and if you press it while crouching, it opens the menu too.
Don't forget, I can only open the pouch when I'm crouching.
The angry video game nerd went on a perfectly well-reasoned rant about button 2 in his video, and I gotta say, it hits the nail on the head, but for the sake of thoroughness, I'll reiterate the problem here. If you want to use an item, you can't be near a door, because pressing the item button will send you through the door. Dark rooms can only be illuminated by a lantern, selecting which requires you to open the menu. If you enter a dark room, you have to wander away from the door before you can open the menu. It's dark, you don't know where the door is. Sometimes the door is huge. Other times, wandering away from the door will just kill you or put you in harm's way. Stabbing a friendly character with your sword will initiate dialogue, conversation undoubtedly being a highlight in this game.
Come on, hurry! It's awful! Mayor Cavendish has been chained in the tower! Oh my cakes! Come see me in Sakado!
However, sometimes there's enemies nearby. Since it's a good idea to kill enemies before they kill you, you try slashing them, but all you do is reactivate the conversation over and over again, which often results in you getting hit. You could broadly refer to these issues as overlapping input commands, and they are a constant issue. It's like a pile of small annoyances that build up into this perpetual, low-grade frustration that I'll just forever associate with this game. I mentioned before that you'll sometimes have to precisely jump slash in order to hit some enemies. The problem with this is that there's a small buffer time after each action that disallows you from doing anything else. Sometimes you'll jump and hit the attack button, but no swing will come out. You have to deliberately jump, give it a moment, and then attack. Even something as trivial as ducking or turning around will often require you to stop and let the game breathe for a moment. It's difficult to explain, but I hope you get what I'm saying here. It's just very bad game feel. Platforming is a major part of these games. You're required to make some very precise jumps while dealing with enemies spawning in. And these games love to spawn in endless enemies. You're never safe, you have to keep moving. Whether you're attacking, ducking, moving, or jumping, about 15% of the input commands you issue will just never happen on screen, at least not in the way they should, and that is a huge problem. Even when the movement commands work, the respawning enemies automatically move to your Y position, so dodging isn't an option. If you've got 3 enemies coming at you from either side, it's like, pick your poison because you're gonna get hit. The gameplay is built on this foundation of unavoidable damage, unreliable controls, and unfair deaths. But, as lousy as it feels, the gameplay isn't really what people remember these games for, is it? Let's talk about the cutscenes. Animation Magic struck a deal with a small Russian team to produce these animated cutscenes on the cheap. Philip's budget for both these games was about $600,000 in total, and they only had about a year of earnest development time to finish both Gamelon and Faces of Evil. That is a small budget, and that is not a lot of time to develop 2 games on brand new and unfamiliar hardware. Bear in mind, the Philips CD-i was the first CD-based game console ever made. With these budgetary and time restrictions in mind, a team led by one Igor Razbov was placed under the Animation Magic banner and got to work on the cutscenes. The Soviet Union had recently dissolved. That meant government funding for animation projects dried up and the country was just in a state of economic uncertainty. In short, the animation industry was gutted, and that meant that outsourced projects from abroad were a desirable way to make some pocket change. The results are what they are, but hey, you get what you pay for. The cutscenes on their own are legendary, but what really ties them together for me is the voice acting.
Oh my goodness, this is awful!
The voices themselves were performed by union actors from New England.
Oh, goody! Mashed link for the main course!
I gotta say, as hilarious as the voices are, I wouldn't have it any other way. I don't even think they're doing a particularly bad job. It is ridiculously over the top, but they're actually giving it some energy here.
Do you know what it means when you lose your last ruby? Now you work for me! Take him away!
They were probably told this was just some children's animated thing, and I don't know, they're doing pretty good. The designs themselves are pretty nightmarish, and as Philips was only given license for a small number of Nintendo characters, they kinda just invented some new ones. Impa is a familiar face, and to be fair, she's pretty accurate to Nintendo's concept art. There's memorable characters, such as this chef.
My cakes will burn!
Apparently he's named Harbano. I don't remember that. He gives Zelda a breadstick, and I'm still not sure what it does.
Ha! The Arpagos will die for them. Ha ha ha.
There's Hektan, a minor villain who dies in one hit.
You've killed me!
Good.
Memorable nonetheless. In Faces of Evil, there's Guonam, the lovable wizard and Link's mentor.
Squadala, we're off!
I've always wondered about Squadala. What do you think it means? Is it like a magic word that propels the carpet? Perhaps an expression of joy and excitement at the adventure to follow. The Allah part better have nothing to do with God, or Nintendo's gonna have to start recalling these discs and replacing it with Abracadabra, we are off! Now I've been debating in my head for a while which of the 2 shopkeepers is best here. In Wand of Gamelon, you got Ushram.
Course I'm on your side. but I still have to sell the stuff. Just pick what you want. I'll handle the rubies.
His animation is just apeshit. He looks like something you'd see in the night sky if you're on magic mushrooms. No matter which frame you pause in, the result is a magnificent work of art. On the other hand, you've got Morshu, which is Ushram backwards.
Lamp oil, rope, bombs? You want it? It's yours, my friend, as long as you have enough rubies.
This guy is iconic, and I'm sure he has more fans by virtue of his meme status. His animation isn't as bonkers, and his character design is actually kinda passable, but that line, man.
Lamp oil, rope, bombs? You want it?
I don't know, there's something about it that just kills me every time. All of the voice actors have a very sharp emphasis on each syllable. Oh boy! I'm so hungry, I could eat an Octorok. My ship sails in the morning. It's such a quirky line delivery, and it's kinda universal across the games. I really can't imagine Zelda CD-i leaving any kind of lasting impression without these cutscenes. They're really not there in any technical sense, but I can't deny that they got pretty creative with some of them.
Whatever I see, I shall devour.
As far as the in-game visual design, I gotta admit, I was surprised. It's not half bad. In fact, it looks downright pleasant at times. There's a nice pastel quality to the background, and a sort of simple, warm Bob Ross feel, with great attention to detail and a lot of level-appropriate clutter adding some personality to these areas. They're bright and they're colorful, often incorporating some smoke, water, or fire to prevent them from appearing too static, giving some movement, although that isn't always the case. As surprisingly nice as it looks, there's a fundamental problem with this visual approach. That painted quality isn't really conducive to the game's precision platforming. Donkey Kong Country is a terrific platformer, but it faces sort of a similar problem. Because of its pre-rendered visuals, it's ever so slightly ambiguous as to where the platform cutoff point is. Now, Donkey Kong makes it work by being generous in the player's favor, focuses less on demanding pixel-perfect jumps and more on challenging the player in other ways. The CD-i Zelda platformers don't offer this generosity, instead opting to leave platforms and their locations up for you to discover, usually through trial and error. There are times where you'll just have to drop onto a log or a rock or something, and you're never confident that it's gonna work out. Because the one time you do take a leap of faith, the game will just decide, nah, that doesn't count. Under normal circumstances, this would be annoying, but compound this with the terrible controls, and the game is effectively ruined in many areas. Some levels are better than others about this, but when they start messing with your perspective, all bets are off. Washubi Swamp is probably the worst offender for this because of all the pitfalls. Combine that with all these enemies that can't be hit at a standard elevation, and it's madness. Madness, I say. I'll be honest, I have a particular bone to pick with Washubi Swamp, partly because of my own incompetence. First of all, this level is just hard, so I had to restart a lot. Second of all, you actually have to play through the entire thing a minimum of twice to get a special item. Third of all, the emulator crashed on me often, and I kept forgetting to save, so I had to play through this level, all in all, probably like 7 times. Aside from the backgrounds, character and enemy sprites are quite nice as well. Consider the average game in 1993, and at a glance these characters look downright arcade quality. Again, bearing in mind that most Zelda traditions hadn't been established, Animation Magic's vision of certain enemies is interesting. The Gomas, for example, are Cyclops crabs. The Moblins are jacked. Initially I saw a caveman with a big red beard, and now I refuse to unsee it. As much as enemies like the Dongos and Wallmasters have been stylized in more recent games, the CD-i was out at a time when this sort of Conan the Barbarian hyper-realism was prevalent, and it's fun to see that spin on Zelda designs. So kudos to the artists, this is quality stuff for 1993, and I don't think it's unreasonable to say that these are among the best looking CD-i games, for whatever that's worth, I guess. In order to keep with the Zelda theme, you're also given items that are used for various purposes throughout the games. Obviously there's lamp oil, rope, and bombs, but it doesn't end there. Throughout levels you'll often find characters that hint at needing certain items.
Those darn Moblin have eaten everything. I'd give anything for an Arpago's egg.
I thought she said Arpagos steak for years. Apparently it's Arpagos egg. Go figure. If you return to these specific areas, the characters will either trade you for useful items or upgrade your current ones. For instance, find a heat crystal for the blacksmith and you can upgrade your sword to fire beams when you're at full health. Find a specific character towards the end of the game and you can fire the beam even without full health. Bottles that carry healing water can also be found, entirely optional at that, which is actually pretty cool. You really have to make mental notes about which characters you've interacted with, what they need, and where they are in the world. As for the main 3 items, let's start with lamp oil. Throughout the game there are many areas that'll just go dark on you. It's almost impossible to navigate under these conditions, so you'll have to go into your inventory and activate your lamp. Doing so consumes 1 lamp oil, and it only lasts for about 15 seconds or so until you've upgraded your lamp. Thankfully, even when it's dark, enemy sprites stay illuminated, but it's still a pain in the ass to pause and select your lamp every time. It also just feels unnecessary. This whole mechanic really adds nothing to the game, but yet another resource that you have to keep track of. Every time you run out of any item, you have to go all the way back to Sakado, enter the shop, and buy the items before leaving. Enemies never drop items, only rupees. Excuse me, rubies.
Rubies?
And there aren't any pots or crates to smash either. It all just feels like busy work. Bombs actually have some utility. They explode in this omnidirectional blast, which takes care of most enemies in one hit. There are also walls or boulders that are destroyed by bomb blasts, sometimes requiring upward of 10. Okay, this is just purely designed to waste your time. For certain enemies or bosses, they're necessary as well. What this means is you can get into situations where you're just fucked. You can only exit the level through these predetermined points at the beginning and end. So if you need bombs but don't have them, you just have to die 3 times so you're sent back to the map. This is why pots exist in Zelda, by the way, so you don't have to waste 15 minutes of your time for one specific item. At the very least, bombs can be used to clear enemies off screen. Considering the sometimes rather unfair quantity of spawn points, you'll want a decent supply of them. Lastly, you've got rope. Using a rope underneath a solid platform will allow you to climb up to that spot. It's actually pretty helpful and kind of a neat feature. You can circumvent certain annoying platforming challenges if you bring a good supply of rope, and like bombs, there are rare occasions that they'll be necessary. Certain magical items you'll obtain can also be used in different ways too. The power glove just demolishes some of the tougher enemies, and the magic cloak gives you a very brief period of invulnerability. Then there's items like the cape, which just lets you jump a little further. The trajectory on this thing is so specific that there's only like 2 times you'll ever need it, which might actually put it ahead of the Dominion Rod in terms of usefulness. As a general rule of thumb, if the item is useful, it uses rubies as a resource. Between the ruby using items and the constant need to purchase more bombs, there's a surprising amount of grinding you'll be doing in Wand of Gamelon. Honestly, for things like the invincibility cloak or the power glove, making it a pain is fair game. These are both really useful items that'll get you out of a jam. The problem is more so the constant need to buy lamp oil, rope, and bombs. Even if you absolutely stack yourself with them, you'll inevitably have to grind and return to the store. That's in no small part because due to the controls, you'll probably accidentally use and waste half your item supply. So as infamous as these games are, there's actually a few areas in which they succeed. Both of the games have vastly different environments, and I've already mentioned how good the visual design is here, but both of those elements lend themselves to some really impressive level variety. The villages actually look quite nice, and finding keys or characters throughout your journey, you'll unlock new areas to explore. Instead of phoning it in, they actually get quite creative with all the castles, shipwrecks, and forests. Lots of interesting layouts and unique challenges. That doesn't stop them from sabotaging it with infinitely respawning homing enemies, but credit where it's due. I've also got to say, the music in both of these games is actually good. Really good. Not amazing, but way better than it has any right to be. It's multi-layered but still catchy, kinda marrying the composition style you get from the old cartridge-based games with CD quality music. It's also interesting to me that different areas of the same levels subtly alter that area's track. It's a really nice touch. Between the two games, Faces of Evil takes the cake though. First of all, excessive use of the digital slap bass adds a funkiness that really eases the pain of actually playing the game. Second of all, there are some really atmospheric tracks. Third of all, there are some really hype tracks. The only real problems I have with the soundtrack is that the songs are too short and don't loop well. And also, the same instrument samples are used too often, which makes them feel repetitive. Aside from that, there's really not much to complain about in the music department. Now, the majority of bosses in this game are pitifully easy. Rather than duking it out using the skills you've learned in the area, defeating most bosses involves just throwing an item at them.
This round! No! It's gold!
Sometimes the game will add projectiles or enemies nearby just for some cheap difficulty. This culminates in the famous Ganon battle.
Dare bring light to my lair? You must die!
Between this game and Faces of Evil, this is actually the more intimidating version of Ganon, if you can believe it. So you throw the titular wand at him, and there you have it. Ganon is defeated.
The chains! No! You haven't seen the last of me!
Father!
You saved me!
Here's the traitor, your majesty. Please.
For some reason, when you talk to NPCs, there'll be like one guy on the map here, and then all of a sudden there's like 15 characters involved in the conversation.
Stop looking at yourself.
What happened?
It's a good thing Zelda has no impulse control. If she didn't just grab someone else's property and destroy it, Link would have been trapped in eternal torment, and we never would have got Faces of Evil. So that's Wand of Gamelon. We'll take a look at Faces of Evil as well, obviously not in as much depth because it's a sister game to Gamelon. They play almost identically. But there's a few notable differences worth pointing out. Before we launch into it though, I want to talk about my own personal experience with these games. When it comes to Wand of Gamelon and Faces of Evil, I can honestly say that there are few games that have actually impacted my sense of humor to such a stark degree, that have given me such joyful memories despite never having played them up until a couple of weeks ago. If you weren't on YouTube in the early days, you might not know what a huge impact these games had on internet culture. I am, of course, talking about YouTube poop.
Oh, you got to be fucking with me. Would you make me a sandwich?
No.
Watch me swing right in. Swing.
A YouTube poop is a video where certain pieces of media are chopped up or remixed. This often has TV or video game characters saying things that they never really did. Due to the sheer absurdity of the Nintendo CD-i games, they were prime source material for these videos and became synonymous with the name YouTube poop.
Zelda, Duke Onkled is under attack by the evil forces of Ganon. I'm going to Gamelon to aid him.
But Father, what if something happens to you?
Oh, shit! I'm going to die. Help me. Save me. Protect me. Send Link.
No way.
My boy, you're going to Gamelon.
No, I won't go there.
What the hell? You do what I'm saying.
Fuck you, the king.
I'd be willing to bet a large number of you who already knew about the CD-i games were probably introduced to them in this poop format, I being in that group myself. If you weren't around for the heyday of the YTP, these details may seem unnecessary or pedantic, but there's some real significance in this movement. This was during the internet's Wild West is being tamed phase. You could say it was a counterculture movement of a sort. Taking media and desecrating it in the most hilarious, eccentric way. In a way, it's kind of a microcosm of what makes the internet so awesome in the first place. Now, YouTube poop isn't dead. It still lives on in many forms out in the ether. But as the internet has become spit-shined, organized, and corporatized, that
spirit of community that comes from being on the fringes of something, participating in a new medium that only elite few will ever understand, has gone away as an inevitable consequence.
Hey, Zelda! I just want to say, it sure is boring without you.
Now, I've cut my teeth on the creation and consumption of many a YTP in my day, so I've long been haunted by the visages of characters such as Guonam and King Harkinian. This was probably my first exposure to memes, and it really impacted my sense of humor in those mid-2000s internet days, along with Homestar Runner, of course. To me, YTP was random humor done right. There is just something perennially hilarious about these characters reacting to nonsense situations. That said, let's tuck into Faces of Evil. It's time to wrap up this duology, I'd say.
I'm not sure if these games are both part of the same canon or just potential alternative histories, but anyway, Ganon is back, and this time it's up to Link to save the day.
It is written, only Link can defeat Ganon.
You know, what a prophecy. No cryptic bullshit, no room for interpretation, just straight up. Only Link can defeat Ganon. I don't know what this says, nobody does. He could just be pulling the whole prophecy out of his ass.
Once again, we're presented with a world map screen, and this one is quite different than Gamelon. Pretty cool, actually. I dig the dark tribal aesthetic. The flow of the game unfolds pretty much the same as the previous, down to the opening area containing a shop that you'll have to periodically return to. You'll actually be doing this less often in Gamelon, though, as Faces of Evil tends to rely more on specific items and less on the big three we've come to expect. There are two new projectile items you'll be using instead, the Snowball and the Firestone. These items will drop one at a time from certain enemies, and are used to kill other specific enemies. This means that, yes, once again, you can complete most of a level, come across a roadblock, and then go all the way back before traveling somewhere else to farm items. Thankfully, I'm wise to the game's tricks at this point, so I just spent 30 minutes gathering everything I could possibly need. Riveting gameplay you expect from Zelda. I would say that between the two games, Faces of Evil is the harder one. There are a lot more specific platforming challenges. Using rafts, for instance, is usually horse shit. There are also more enemies that spawn in unexpectedly, and by the end game they do significantly more damage. Even once you know where the spawn points will be, dodging or blocking with your shield is very difficult. This is the result of the aforementioned issue of imprecise hitboxes. You just have to rely on luck as much as you do skill. How Long to Beat says you can beat this game in 90 minutes, but I say you'd have to be a seasoned pro for that to be true. For me, Gamelon took probably 5 hours to complete, with Faces taking another 6 or 7, crashing and forgetting to save notwithstanding. The environments in Faces are more varied and creative than Gamelon, which itself was more focused on the generic fantasy angle. Here you get wintry plains, fun houses, volcanoes, ancient temples, lots of different stuff, all just as visually appealing as the last game. I thought I was failing to unlock the next area, but it turns out it's just hidden, up here. Saragon Caves, hidden in a plume of volcano smoke. That's a me problem. The cutscenes are back and the characters look more ridiculous than ever.
My hero!
I know I'm supposed to be focusing on the kissing thing, but I just can't tear my eyes away from Link's rock-hard little ass. None of the cutscenes are particularly good quality, but the range of badness is quite significant. Some of them are sort of competent, while others look like they were drawn by people with no concept of anatomy. Faces of Evil's take on Ganon is permanently burned into my mind, particularly his face.
Join me, Link, and I will make your face the greatest in Korodai, or else you will die.
This is the greatest face in Korodai. He looks so fucking stupid. Last time it was the wand, this time it's a book.
No! Not into the pit! It burns!
I gotta say, Ganon should either start sending surrogates to do his dirty work, or stop assuming people won't show up to his lair with the very specific weaknesses he leaves lying around.
Not into the pit! The chains! No! The shroud! No!
Also, for some reason, in both games, after Ganon is defeated, there's still a little drippy drop that could theoretically hit and kill you, which is just hilariously malicious on the designer's part.
Why'd did you do that?
I just saved you from Ganon.
You did not.
Well done, Link. Ganon is once again imprisoned. Come.
A game that begins with
Only Link can defeat Ganon.
ends with Link saying,
I won!
You know, I'd say the real winners in this scenario are those of us who discovered these games in the mid-2000s thanks to their resurgence in the form of YouTube poop and whatever else. I'm still flabbergasted by their existence. It's just a weird footnote in Nintendo's existence. Watching those cutscenes back, it still hits me in that some kind of way. And in the end, those cutscenes, that's what makes the biggest impression here. There's just a cocktail of circumstances that leads to them being utterly fascinating. The terrible animation quality, the trippy visuals, the eccentric voice acting, it all works together to create something ridiculously memorable, and the bad script ties it all together. You know, my cats have been really chewing on this green screen for like 45 minutes.
As for the game itself, it's not abysmal, nor is it actually good and misunderstood. It's just bad, like normal levels of bad. Despite some surprisingly solid presentation, the controls, hitboxes, and excessive reliance on items take a game that'd otherwise be boring and just drop it down into annoying. Still, having read about the game's story, including an interview with the original director, I can't help but be impressed. For a bunch of designers working with brand new technology, a paltry budget, and an unbelievable time crunch, it's a miracle that this game was released at all.
And though I certainly don't recommend playing it, I'd say we're a little, richer for its existence. Now, I'm a great guy. Some would even go so far as to call me a hero.
You, Magic Lord, are the hero of you.
Not my words. But it occurs to me that there are some sick, twisted people in this world. Creative people, but people who would rather use that power for evil than good.
Some treacherous individual called Dopley spent 4 years of their life recreating Wand of Gamelon and Faces of Evil in the Game Maker engine. I feel obligated at this point to at least check it out. If you're interested in doing the same, a link will be in the description. Much of the presentation remains as it was in the originals. The only difference with the cutscenes is that they now have subtitles. The actors enunciate each word so clearly that it's mostly unnecessary, but if you're deaf, you can now get a sumptuous taste of the original Kino. I also appreciate the closed captions, very evocative. This remastered version uses sprites and backgrounds ripped from the original game, but outside of that, the gameplay has actually been changed quite significantly. The most immediate and obvious difference is that the game runs at 60 FPS. Both your character's movements as well as the enemies are much smoother, and the screen scrolls with no jittering like the original. The attack animations are better, and hitboxes are sometimes more reliable. Some of them actually feel worse than the original, and I think this is because the colliders are now located in the enemy's center mass. That's just a guess. Because of the game's speed being improved, you'll also find enemies close in on you much faster, but thankfully you have that same advantage. You can attack and jump at the same time, and you can change your trajectory mid-air as well. This increased reliability makes the act of navigation so much more enjoyable. It's really hard to put into words how much of a difference this is. It completely changes the game. Enemies that previously stopped spawning after being killed now respawn every time you change your screen. This is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it's much easier to farm rubies now, but on the other, it's very frustrating to have enemies come back every time you go inside of a house. Speaking of buying things and using doors, the game now uses 4 buttons instead of just 2, which is kind of a weird overcorrection. Especially considering it actually keeps some of the little control quirks of the original, like having to crouch in order to use the menu. It kinda just makes things confusing when you're dealing with a screen full of enemies. The gameplay doesn't strive to match the original one-to-one at all, so it would have been nice if those aspects of the control were kinda ironed out a bit. Basically, the game is much smoother and more enjoyable when platforming is involved, and way more obnoxious to play when combat is involved. If you don't care at all about gameplay accuracy and just want to see what these games have to offer, this is probably a good option. It's a hilarious idea for a passion project, and I can respect the work that went into it. I'm sure Dopley learned a lot of valuable game dev lessons just by making this masterpiece.
When talking about the CD-i Zelda games, the limelight is inevitably given to the Faces of Evil and the Wand of Gamelon. They are loud, they are absurd, and they demand to be seen. Yet there is another that is often glossed over, but in many ways I consider it to be the most interesting of the trilogy, and that's Zelda's Adventure.
Unlike the other two Zelda CD-i games, Zelda's Adventure was not developed by Animation Magic. Philips still had license to make games with these characters' likenesses, so they contracted Viridis Corporation to make a Zelda game of their own. Unlike the Saturday morning cartoon feeling of the other two, Zelda's Adventure leaned into a photorealistic style. It's important to note that photorealistic graphics had a very different connotation in the early 90s. While development began all the way back in 1992, prior to the release of Animation Magic's games, Viridis was contacted by Philips during development. Apparently, the first two Zelda games weren't helping CD-i sales much. Go figure. Their strategy was to make this game closer to the recently released Link to the Past, which was getting rave reviews and solidifying Zelda's top-down identity. Viridis would be told to take the CD-i to its limits, so the company would boast about their game's incredible graphics and breadth of content, up to 300 hours of playtime, according to CD-i Magazine. It's likely that Viridis ran into difficulties because Zelda's Adventure would only release in May of 1996, a full 4 years since development had begun, and only a few months before Philips would officially give up on the CD-i. The game also only launched in the UK, despite plans for an international release. It's tough to gauge critical reception because, well, who the fuck owned a Philips CD-i? By this time, prototype Zelda 64 footage was already getting people amped for 3D. Ain't nobody sticking around for this. However, Philips CD-i Magazine did give the game a positive review, and I'm sure they're in no way biased. All of these circumstances led to Zelda's Adventure being the lesser known of its ilk. I'd also wager there's many less copies floating around, given the average price of one nowadays. Booting the game up, you can see what Viridis meant by photorealistic. Instead of cartoons, you get FMV sequences featuring real-life actors poorly superimposed over background. So we've saved Gamelon, we've saved Korodai. What land do you reckon we'll save next? Hyrule, maybe?
And so it was that Ganon, Lord of Darkness, had taken over Ptolemaic.
Wrong. This time we're saving Ptolemaic. Where the hell is that? According to the manual, it's in southeastern Hyrule. I don't even understand, why are they limiting themselves? Wouldn't Ganon represent a greater threat if he just wanted to take over Hyrule in general? Is this some kind of slick political power play?
Can you argue that that nuclear pact, as it was ratified, was a good deal?
In the darkest nightmare hour, when not moon nor sun has risen, I take Zelda in my power. I shall keep her in my prison.
Whatever the case, it's the standard Zelda setup. Treasures of the elements have been stolen, you gotta get them back. Though once again, it's Link who's been captured this time, meaning you'll play as Zelda again. The budget for Zelda's Adventure was so low that all of the actors were played by office staff, with the receptionist playing Zelda. This was confirmed by the composer, Marc Andrade, who plays the wise sage Gaspra. I just want to mention that Andrade was hired by Viridis because he knew how to use a Macintosh computer, so for his skills to be used in this way is particularly hilarious. Before the game even starts, two of its most persistent issues are on full display. First, this cursor is so slow. It might not seem like an issue yet, but trust me, it's a problem. Second of all, the load times in this game are frustrating. It's particularly brutal when you save or load a game, but small delays are prevalent throughout the game. Changing screens results in about 5 full seconds of downtime. Now that might not sound like much, but when you multiply it by every screen in the game, you're looking at like half an hour of just sitting there in silence. Not to play Zelda on a pedestal, but the game literally begins on one. Here you can get a better idea of what the game looks like and how it plays. If you crop the top 10% of the screen, there's essentially no indication that you're playing a Zelda game at all. For all of their problems, at least the animation Magic games had some aesthetic similarities to Zelda. The game opts for a top-down view this time. Despite the FMV intro, the game doesn't have much of a narrative angle, so structurally it's more similar to the original game than Link to the Past. What I mean by that is you're dropped off in the world and basically told to find all 7 shrines. This game, to its credit I suppose, is a pretty huge map. You can't access all 7 shrines off the hop, but you can get lost shortly after starting the game. You've got to go find some new items before traveling to the first shrine, which introduces you to some game mechanics. You gotta fill up a bottle with water, and I know I'm at the risk of retreading some AVGN steps here, but this really is emblematic of how interactions work in this game. After you get the bottle, you've gotta follow the river back to its source. On that screen, you can use the bottle anywhere, and it'll just magically fill with water before appearing on the map. Anytime you've got to use items, they can almost always be used anywhere on that screen rather than in a specific spot. Let me tell you, you will be using many items in this game. There's only one button mapping for every single item you have. Zelda's wand, for example, which acts like a sword, that'll take up your item slot. Potions, projectile weapons, hell, even when you want to pay for something in-game, you gotta manually select rupees, exit the menu, use them, go back into the menu, switch back to your wand or whatever it is you want, and then exit the menu again. Remember when I mentioned the cursor screen being annoying? Well, here it is. With only one accessible item at a time in this game, you're in this menu a lot. The item display is actually quite small on top of that, so you have to scroll for a while before finding what you need a lot of the time. Like the previous games in this video, Zelda's adventure is sporadically populated by characters. Interactions are much less interesting without the wacky Russian animation, but still entertaining.
Oh, it's a young girl. Don't touch anything. People steal me blind. I know you all hate me. What did I ever do to any of you? I give an honest...
As mentioned, office staff played the characters in this game, and that goes for the voice acting too.
You're no friend to us down here. I've failed in my mission. Lord, this enemy is coming!
The first shrine in the game is the Shrine of Earth. It's very straightforward, and for the most part, you can expect the same from other dungeons. In most Zelda games, your progress will be barred with obstacles. You'll find items, usually inside of dungeons, that not only circumvent those specific obstacles, but also carry utility in combat or exploration. When you unlock the hookshot, for example, you start thinking of all the ledges that were previously out of your reach. Could the hookshot be used there? That's not really how items or obstacles work in this game. For the most part, what'll really block your progress is enemies. There are a few foes in this game that can only be vanquished with an extremely specific item. The Pole's voice, for example, can only be destroyed by the noise spell. That'll add up for anybody who's read the original game manual. However, the spells or items you need to take care of certain enemies are often a guessing game entirely. You'll reach a certain point in the dungeon, try everything you have, and when nothing works, you'll sigh and make your walk of shame to the exit, and explore the lands in search of the right spell. There are items that have some limited use as well. Candles can brighten up dark rooms, but it's usually not necessary. A ladder can be used to cross this canyon, but only on one specific screen of the game. A plank can be used to cross this broken bridge, but only on one specific screen in the game. A raft can be used to cross this body of water, but only on one specific screen in the game. Part of the fun of Zelda is being given unrestricted access to the world and experimenting to see how items interact with that world. Zelda's adventure both looks and plays more closely to like an FMV adventure game. Items are used to progress and then tossed out immediately. The only thing that differentiates it from that genre is the fact that there's combat. Well, I guess there's combat in some FMV adventure games, but I digress. I'm going to talk about combat now. First, the good. The attack animation is improved slightly. You can actually see an arc to your swing, and there's more than one frame to give you some feedback. Technically, the game gives you some limited invincibility when you're hit, although it's very fickle about when and how that works. Completing shrines will reward you with extra hit points and attack power, and over time that becomes noticeable. Troublesome enemies from the beginning become quite easy to deal with, and it's nice to feel some sense of progression. Finally, in regard to the spells and projectiles I'd mentioned before, there is an absolute laundry list of them. The number of options you have by the end is ridiculous. Some of them act in unique ways, like flying in every direction or dispersing in an arc, but for the most part these are quite redundant. They're used for quote-unquote puzzle solving twice or so throughout the game, which usually just means hitting an orb from the other side of the room. Like the previous CD-i Zelda games, items here use rupees as a resource. They're actually rupees this time, by the way, not rubies anymore. Every enemy in this game will either drop a heart, 5 rupees, or 10 rupees. I have never seen anything else drop. Thankfully, this makes rupee farming quite straightforward. Unfortunately, rupee farming is still very necessary, and actually even more so than the side-scrolling games. On top of constantly having to buy expensive items, you'll really be wanting to use rupee-consuming spells instead of relying on your wand. That's because the combat is atrocious. You don't want to be anywhere near an enemy unless you absolutely have to be, and that's for one simple reason: the hitboxes. The hitboxes in this game are bad. Like, I'm talking unreal bad. They feel like they're automatically generated. I can't imagine that they were handmade by developers. Often just entering an enemy's vicinity will cause you to take multiple hearts of damage. Like many aspects of the other games, a lot of this just comes down to luck. Enemy placements are pre-arranged, so sometimes you'll enter a new screen and just immediately be hit by no fault of your own. You gotta know beforehand, oh okay, the enemy is gonna spawn here, so I've gotta move through this part of the screen. It's even worse when an enemy has a specific weakness. See, when you extend your wand, the spell will sort of start its trajectory in front of it. Yet if your wand even touches the enemy, the spell will cancel out and fail to do any damage. So you have to create a minimum distance between you and the enemy. This is frustrating because the enemy behavior in this game is almost universally just follow Zelda closely, so creating distance is easier said than done. Half the time you'll accidentally enter the transition area and move to another screen, losing your progress as the enemy regains all of their health. Hitboxes sounds like one small facet of the gameplay experience, but it's really the most consistent issue in Zelda's adventure, and the only deficiency that you can't really plan for. Often it works in your favor as well, as enemies inexplicably take damage, but that's a gamble I'd rather not have to take. Thankfully, the game is reasonable about player death. If you die on the overworld map, you'll respawn at the center pedestal, with all of the resources and whatnot you've accumulated. If you die in a dungeon, you'll respawn at the beginning of the dungeon with most enemies defeated. If you die in a boss fight, you'll spawn right outside the boss room. This is great, except for the fact that you might be out of rupees from the fight, so you'll actually have to manually leave the shrine to go grinding before coming back and fighting all of the enemies over again. That's because bosses take specific spells to be killed, and if you don't have rupees, you're just screwed. Like other Zelda games, there's a rudimentary form of fast travel here as well. In each dungeon you'll find a compass, which can be used on the overworld map to warp you to its associated dungeon entrance. This is actually a pretty nice inclusion, especially when you consider the sheer size of the world. There are still many inconvenient jogs, but the game will slowly unlock shortcuts, which cuts down on the tedium a little bit. After completing the Earth Shrine, you're given this little scene where Gaspra talks about your quest, and the audio mixing is so shit I can't even understand what he's saying.
Hurry now. You must travel to a place festival. Rumor tells it is found in the great forest to the north. And remember, all is not what it seems.
But anyway, you'll get vague hints about where to go next or what to do. What elemental dungeon would you expect after the Earth Shrine? An ice cavern? Some kind of a wind temple, maybe? How about a circus full of wacky illusions, clowns, and doors that take you back to the beginning of the dungeon? This room, man, this room is the worst. You've got this slippery ice floor and these two wizrobes trying to vaporize you. Just got a tiny bit. Don't overdo it. Ah, fuck. This dungeon is just nonsense. At one point I didn't even know how to progress. I retraced my steps everywhere before finally breaking down and consulting a walkthrough. Big shoutouts to Mundy C, by the way. This is an incredibly well-formatted guide for a game that like 8 people will ever play. Anyway, you have to go to this dead-end room and then equip a knife and stand at the side of the tent and use it to rip a hole in the canvas. I have no idea how you would figure that out. It's such a context-sensitive action. As far as I know, this is the only place it can be done, but hey, I guess I can't say that the dungeons don't have puzzles, can I? In between dungeons, there's actually an assortment of villages you can visit with some shops and NPCs. I like the feel of some of these areas. They're often quite cozy, and I find the visual design growing on me in a strange way. Speaking of which, this is probably a good time to talk about the game's presentation. The outdoor environments have a distinctive satellite photograph look because the team actually used aerial shots of Hawaii in constructing the overworld. Obviously, they've been compressed to hell in order to run on the CD-i, but there's something about it that really transports me back to the 90s. There was a time prior to mainstream 3D games where this idea of realism was king. Using FMV, digitized actors, and photo textures or sprites, games of this style were seen as impressive. Some series took the colorful, cartoonish, and even abstract designs of its older games and converted them into this realism. For the most part, the results are quite comical nowadays, but I have to say, I'm always interested in seeing the interpretations of developers at the time. We've had 3D Zelda kicking around for 25 years, so there's really not much left to the imagination for us. But back in the day, your brain really had to fill in these blanks, and in this way I actually have great respect for Zelda's adventure. In preparation for the game, Viridis hired Jason Bakudis, a professional special effects artist who'd worked on movies. They wanted him to create and animate models to be used in the game, and so he did. That there's so many surviving photographs of these models is a major victory for game preservation. Unfortunately, due to the compression, a lot of the amazing details in his work are all but lost in translation. In the intro, for example, Gaspro looks ridiculous, but the prosthetic makeup used to make the actor look old is actually pretty fantastic. It's easy to see from the images alone just how much he cared about creating something of quality. His vision for enemies such as the Octorok holds up quite well, and I can see something like this comfortably fitting in with modern Zelda. His Ganon sculpture is about 100 times more intimidating than this. Even the interior locations were painstakingly modeled, and I love that little diorama look. It reminds me of an I Spy book, or those little scale models you find in museums. Really imaginative stuff. Not sure how a modern tackle box ended up in the blacksmith shop, but aside from shit like that, the environments and enemy designs are pretty fun. The Pole's voice is definitely an interesting one compared to the original NES Zelda. Also, this mushroom that just kind of hangs out here.
Those moblins out there are so slow and stupid.
You'll die a lot and have to walk past him. That sinister mug still haunts my dreams. And yeah, while I'm talking about it, having to walk through certain areas over and over again is a problem, even after getting a compass. I walked this path about 1,000 times before making it to the second shrine.
Hello there, miss! Watch how you go—
Shut up! Bakudis mentioned Ray Harryhausen as his primary inspiration, which makes perfect sense. Harryhausen was a master of stop-motion film, creating exquisite models and animating them in ways that holds up really well 60 or 70 years later. Unfortunately, many of the enemy animations are very jittery and need a few more frames to feel fluid. I'd hazard a guess here and say that many of the individual frames were dropped because of the CD-i's limitations. Like its animation magic brethren, the art style often directly conflicts with the gameplay. I've already mentioned the terrible hitboxes, but there are problems on the overworld map as well. It's often very difficult to tell where you're supposed to go on a screen. Tiny patches of dirt might be your only way forward, or sometimes splotches in the middle of a screen might be a cave. Because of the collision detection, you might assume it's a random piece of scenery and give up before you even find an entrance. In the shrines, there's also a lot of unnecessary foreground details that obscure enemy positions. A lot of that type of thing, or details in the overworld, appear to be edited in over top of the existing photos. I understand that. It's outrageous to imagine a single artist designing an entire overworld without relying on pre-made tiles, but they often feel haphazardly placed. The low resolution doesn't help either. Critical points of interest are often obfuscated. On top of that, many of the game's screens are real static. There's not much by way of movement, and what little there is pretty limited by 2 or 3 frame animations. Where's the smoke billowing out of the chimneys, the roaring fire in the tavern, the people swigging beer or lon milk or whatever the fuck it is people drink in Tolomak? The game in its portrayal of realism also forgoes music, for the most part. You'll still get some short looping tracks in dungeons, usually sort of a dark ambience, and it's fine. but when you're traversing the overworld, it's just nature ambience. I don't actually hate this either. The sounds are reasonably high quality, and I could comfortably watch half in the bag on my second monitor while rupee grinding. The sounds the enemies make are ridiculous though. Some of the creatures let out a suspiciously human-like grunt when they're hit. I've already talked about the voice acting, but I'll reiterate here. It's bad, and it's funny.
Hello, little one. I hope I can be of help to you. Did you see my dog out on Upper Street? How did he smell?
With his nose, of course!
Maybe Ganon should burn this place to the ground. There's something very, very wrong with these people. Many of the sequences where you do have to get necessary items just make no sense. It's anyone's guess where an important object might be. There's this one part, for instance, where you go into an inn, and the guy outside warns you that you might be robbed, so, you know, be careful.
Be careful if you go inside, milady. Some people in these parts would rob you, same as look at you, they would.
You go inside, everybody's just sitting there, in silence. You approach the innkeeper, and he says some nonsense about bumbleberry tea.
I need to make more bumbleberry tea, that's for certain. What? Oh, I'm sorry, but the lodge is full. You are welcome to rest here before you head out into the forest of Tarian.
Options exhausted, you decide to go back outside, and the guy from before tells Zelda that he has a crush on her before giving her a feather.
I would like to give you a feather as a sign of my affection. This will take you to new heights.
Illogical and unsettling. Other times you're just given false information from the townspeople. You'll be told you can traverse a certain area if you have these boots, but it's just not true.
You can cross any ford in Scotland's river with the red boots.
I don't think it's meant to be deliberately misleading. I think probably they just forgot to implement certain things. It feels like the whole game was written and designed by 100 people all playing a game of telephone. Even when you do figure out where to go or what weapon an enemy is weak to, the game will force you into situations of trial and error. Here's a switch, I decide to go hit it, and now I'm just faced with unavoidable death. You can't hit the switch again to turn off the traps, you just have to sit there reflecting on your mistakes, like committing to a playthrough of Zelda's Adventure on the Philips CD-i. You have to hit the switch from a distance, fair enough, but a total beginner's trap. The game is just plagued with situations like this. There's also an inverse difficulty curve, as things become significantly easier when you've got a bunch of extra hearts and attack damage. There are some easy ways to break the game and bring your rupee count up, and you can literally just walk past this boss without fighting him with no consequence whatsoever. Yeah, I'm thinking they just wanted this thing done so the CD-i could hurry up and die in peace. The final battle is mercifully easy. It's a gauntlet of every shrine boss you've faced so far, which sounds like a big pain, but their health is actually way lower, so it's kind of a joke. Even Ganon himself doesn't put up much of a fight. He teleports around in a predictable pattern, just begging to be hit. At last, Ganon is defeated. Hyrule is... Old Tolamac is saved. The birds are singing. Isn't it beautiful? Link and Zelda hold hands and behold their victory. It's a damn shame that there's no FMV involving Link. I desperately want to know what this actor looks like. It's already funny, and his face is only like 16 pixels wide here. Finally, my journey has come to an end. I can finally close the book on these games at last, or at least I would be able to if somebody didn't make a Game Boy D-make of Zelda's Adventure, which I guess I have to look at too. Alright, John Lay, since you've contributed yet another game to this growing list of CD-i associated media, I guess I'll check it out. As mentioned, the idea here is converting the entirety of Zelda's Adventure into a Game Boy format, emulating Link's Awakening. It's definitely rough around the edges, but I like the idea. It mostly feels like a real authentic early Game Boy game, with all of the foibles that come with that. The combat is lousy, somehow worse than the original. There's once again no animation to speak of. That's a real shame. I was hoping for something adjacent to Link's Awakening, which would actually make the game more playable. Here, Zelda just extends the wand outward, and an exclamation mark appears above the enemy's head if you're dealing damage. Pretty bare bones. It's interesting to see how, without all the strange, realistic graphics and voice acting, the game design is laid bare here. Mostly, it makes you realize how bad it actually is at its core. Look, Ocarina of Time makes you farm rupees in the beginning for a Deku Shield, but it's more nuanced than that. You're forced to explore and understand how the world works. Hunting for rupees teaches you how to navigate 3D spaces, climb vines, jump off ledges, look around corners. You're also encouraged to explore, as blue rupees don't respawn after being obtained. Zelda's adventure has you farming rupees completely arbitrarily. It doesn't teach you anything, you don't stumble across anything interesting, you just fight the same enemies and hope that they don't drop hearts. There's nothing really interesting about it, but hey, kudos to John Lay. I hope he continues to work on this game because there's potential to bring it up to parity with Link's Awakening, at least in some ways. It'd be another kettle of fish entirely to make the dungeons interesting or items more valuable, but I guess we'll see what happens. So I guess you can probably surmise how I feel about Zelda's adventure as a whole. It's just unenjoyable to play, but it's still kind of an interesting game. There's a neat development history here and a lot of craftsmanship put into areas I didn't really expect. I can tell in some ways they actually really cared about the product they were making, and in other critical ways they phoned it in big time to get the sucker done. It comes much closer to the spirit of Zelda than the other games, but still seems to miss the point. It's not about having lots of items, a big world, and a long game. Not 300 fucking hours, mind you, but like longer than Wand of Gamelon. It's about the joy of exploration, the excitement of overcoming fair and balanced challenge. It's about giving the player meaningful items that change their relationship with the game world. But I can't give the developers too much flack, not Animation Magic, nor Viridis. These games have gone down in infamy as some of the worst of all time. Is that true? No, they're not even in the running. They're just bad games whose circumstances are so absurd that they've passed into legend. I'd say on a scale from big rigs, over-the-road racing to whatever your favorite game is, I would put them at about a Yu Yu Hakusho Spirit Detective. What really makes them memorable is the cutscenes, because they're so bad that they loop back around and become good again. That colors the whole experience. They were conceived at a time before Zelda had really found its identity, and by the time they were rediscovered, just the novelty of hearing Link sound like this
Good thing I have my magic pouch. I can carry everything.
Was off the charts. Given how much time I've spent laughing at these characters over the years and wondering about these games, I'd say this whole experience for me has been cathartic. I can now proudly proclaim that I've beaten every Zelda game on the Philips CD-i, and that puts me at the top 0.1% of Zelda fans. It also makes me a giant dickhead with no concept of time value. Don't play them, they're pretty bad. It's mostly a waste of time. Just look up the cutscenes on YouTube. That's all. Thank you for watching. Thank you so much to my patrons for funding my YouTube shenanigans. Let's take a look at some patron questions. Why the one with Max Landis, of course. No, I'm just kidding. Probably Finding Rem Lazar. That one holds a very special place in my heart. I would say grand strategy games like Europa Universalis, for example. I really love the idea of them, and I feel like I would be smarter if I could play them, but I just haven't had the time or energy to invest in learning these games. Oh, I'm bad. This is a brutal question that would probably change every time you ask me. I really liked Uncut Gems. I would say that one's at least close to the top, but there's so many good horror movies, man. The Lighthouse, Hereditary, stuff to choose. Green Room, however, is the most underrated in my opinion. If you like thrillers, I highly, highly recommend checking out Green Room. I haven't really seen enough to outwardly dislike any, but I'll say that The Killing of the Sacred Deer didn't really click with me on first viewing. I have a stock answer for this one. I don't have any current plans, but the next Tales game I review will be Abyss. That's the promise I make. And a special shout out to those in my Persons of Lordly Caliber Patreon tier.
Adam Safranco, Matthew Sean Dick, Banana Turnip, Sleepy, Avil, and also Hime Takamura, Shroom Analyst, Spencer Kennelly, Smo Bun, I'm Emil Castagne's #1 fan, Captain, BB Squirrel, Shane Shack, Mr. Shifty, Buster Drew, Francois, Fanar, Fenrir Lives, Silvar, Yolo Shadow, Guko, Jordan Laughlin, Eldon Rosen, Jordan Miller, Hayden Hudson, Rocket Man, Jay Hyun, Azure Midsummer, Destrega, Tepid Tag Tournament, F, James Adair, Sable Dragon Rook, Cameron himself, Einelhander, Kelly Slaughter, Zeta, and Caleb Wambold. Thank you all so much for your continued support. I'm gonna probably need to take a second breath doing that soon, but we'll see. If you enjoyed the video and you're interested in supporting the channel, please check out my Patreon, link in the description. You can net various Discord rewards, bonus videos, podcast episodes, more stuff coming down the pike. I'm trying to make it worth your while here. In any case, thank you all for watching. Until I see you next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.